we're going to start with a survey. And I want you to consider two contrasting models of leadership. And on the one hand, we have a model of leader as towering, charismatic, take charge figure. On the other hand, we have the kind of leader that was, I think, behind Steve's comments. This would be a collaborator, somebody who builds teams, who develops the leadership of others. So think of these two contrasting models of leadership. And which do you think is more prevalent in the general population? This is your chance to vote. How many think that the towering figure, heroic kind of leader, is prevalent in the general population? Time to vote. Okay, we got some hands. How many think the collaborating model of leadership is prominent? Okay, so it looks pretty mixed out there. My sense is that there may be a difference among the people in this room and the general population. So thinking about your own research and education, how many tend to promote the towering take charge figure? Hands up. Okay, we've got just a few. How many promote the collaborating, leadership developing? Almost everybody. Okay. We scholars of public leadership in particular tend to be very fond of post-heroic models of leadership. We tend to get intellectually excited about collective, shared, distributed, and variations on those themes of leadership. And we insist that leaders potentially can come from every corner of our organizations and communities. And we contrast that with the individualistic, heroic, savior style of leadership. And yet, reality intrudes. Political campaigns in the US, in Europe, Australia and New Zealand even, and other parts of the world, remind us that human beings, we all as human beings, tend to project our most fervent hopes and our most intense fears on towering figures of some kind or other. The great person view of leadership is alive and well. And I am not just talking about Donald Trump, who, people have reminded me that when they see Americans these days, the first question is, what about that guy? And all the people that are, hovering around him. But, of course, we have Vladimir Putin. We have the continued appeal of people like Marine Le Pen, although I think she did badly yesterday, maybe, Erdogan, and Mrs. Park from Korea, who, despite being impeached, has a huge following still, right? So the times are fertile for tough-talking, strong-handed, power-hoarding people who can channel anti-establishment anger, distrust of institutions. So some of you may have come across the Edelman Trust Barometer. Anybody familiar with that? It was issued in time for the Davos Forum. And the people who put together this trust barometer do surveys around the world. Now, I don't know a whole lot about their methodology, but they're just one report that indicates a worldwide dip in trust of traditional institutions. They found that a dip across the board between 2016 and 2017. They say that confidence levels in government are at 41%. So that'd be less than half of the populations that they sampled would be thinking, okay, I've got some confidence in government. Media, 43%. Business, 52%. Nonprofits, just a tweak better, 53%. When they asked about confidence in government leaders, 29%. Whoa. That's pretty severe. Now, they did say that the informed public, which would include everybody in this room, had slightly better ideas, views of what's going on with institutions. Maybe because those folks tend to be in charge of those institutions. I don't know. So that's the situation that we're in. Fertile times for these take charge, charismatic, towering figures. However, I would say it's also fertile times for people from every walk of life to come forth and offer new solutions and to resist the unraveling of projects they hold dear. So we had in January women's marches around the world, and ongoing, at least in the US, organizing by the same folks that were involved with those women's marches. Black Lives Matter is another example in the US. So it's also fertile times for people who are more in the collaborating mode of leadership to show up as well.
So this conference actually came at a terrific time. The timing was perfect for us to be asked to speak here, because we had also been asked by Eric Hunt's client to do a review of the more recent scholarship around public leadership or collective leadership for public purposes for the journal Public Management Review. And so you're going to hear the first results of our review of the literature for the scholarly literature for the last 10 years around collective leadership for public purposes. And we were also asked by Eric Hans to offer our suggestions for the way forward for this leadership field. So thank you, Alessandro and Jean, and everybody who invited us to do this, because it gave us an extra impetus to work on this particular project. So, whoops, let me back up. So our project was, our charge was to provide an overview of the state of the field, including definitions. How do people define public leadership or leadership for public purposes? What are prominent trends in the field, particularly in the last decade or so in the scholarly literature? And then what are the key findings? What do we conclude are key findings from this literature? Plus also some suggestions for a way forward for the field. So what do we see as what appear to be promising theories, and what are productive methods and types of studies to pursue? So we started with a literature review. We wanted to cast a very broad net, so we used a variety of terms in various combinations, including collective leadership and governance, public leadership and governance, democratic leadership and governance, public leadership and diversity, and search for these terms as keywords for articles, but also in abstracts. And we'll tell you a little bit more about what we found out of that. But let me now turn it over to Barbara.
So in the next slide, you'll see this slide, that people in public leadership have tended to follow the path of leadership studies generally. And in fact, we of course have contributed to leadership studies generally. For many, many years, leadership scholars have tended to define leadership in a way that focuses on the attributes and behaviors of people in formal positions of authority, to some extent more in line with the charismatic take charge model of leadership. Certainly by the 90s, though, and dating further back, we mentioned the work of Mary Parker Follett in our paper, the notion of leadership as an ethical process that really is about the interaction of leaders and followers in mutually beneficial ways. That definition of leadership as a relationship that is mutually beneficial also is one that is shown up in public leadership scholarship. And then a third kind of approach, which we've really been involved with, again, becoming more prominent in the 1990s, of leadership as public problem solving on behalf of organizations and communities. So that's been a strong stream, certainly for the last, I would say, almost 30 years, something like that. Now there is an increasing stream, some of you may count yourselves in that vein, of saying that leadership is actually the property of a system that encompasses human interactions and leads to collective achievement. Steve has been with us at some conferences at the Wagner School in New York, and a lot of people there have that kind of perspective. So that's growing in terms of the people who are interested in network analysis, for example. So that's a newer kind of development, I would say, in the sense of leadership definitions. There are also folks who talk about what is unique or distinctive about public leadership. And so Montgomery Van Wart, whom many of you are familiar with, has said it's a focus on what people, managers in government and in nonprofit organizations do as they guide and somehow innovate in these organizations. So Monty, in a way, is focusing on the people that we're speaking to as scholars, trying to assist their practice and understand their practice. And then the second quote here comes from a group, I don't know if any of you were at the Middlebrook Conference in 2008, a group of younger scholars put together kind of a manifesto as a result of that conference, saying that we ought to think about public leadership as leadership for the common good or creating public value. So we certainly liked the sound of that particular definition. So we're certainly going to say more about that aspect shortly. Then John mentioned that we had looked at some of the review articles that have come out recently about public leadership, and particularly the one that Monty Van Wart did in 2013, a more recent one by Sonia Ospina, 2016, I think, in Public Administration Review. Those two really help us get a grip on the state of the field, particularly at the organizational level. So they emphasize that the theory building and empirical work has increased over the last, say, 12, 15 years, very substantially. At the same time, Monty in particular points out that most of the empirical studies have concentrated on a particular model of leadership that was developed, well, at the very beginning by James McGregor Burns. If you know transformational transactional theory, the very beginning of it was James McGregor Burns' work in 1978. But the model that's usually used in empirical studies was developed by Bernard Bass and Bruce Avolio much later. And I would say it strayed a bit from James McGregor Burns' original formulation. But at any rate, that continues to be one of the main models that's used in public leadership research as well as leadership research generally. Some research on leader-member exchange in organizations, so that continues both in the general field of leadership studies and public leadership, and then increased attention to shared, distributed, integrative, collective leadership. So those would be very strong trends in the literature up to this point. Monty also talks about the emergence of a third model of public leadership. The first being, you might say, the traditional hierarchical model that says leadership is what's exercised by the political and appointed officials and maybe the very top administrators in government and maybe of nonprofit organizations. That'd be the first model. The second model, emerging with new public management, this entrepreneurial manager role, you know, that you can innovate and get a lot of results and so forth. And he talks about now the emergence of a third model that emphasizes collaborative process, responsiveness to multiple stakeholders, inclusion of multiple stakeholders, and so on. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the state of the field.
So Barbara's given you a, whoops, let me back up here, kind of a broad overview of what we were finding. I want to talk now in a little more detail about what we found. So let me go here. So when we did this search of the literature, we came up with literally thousands of articles. I mean, it was just stunning to see how many there were. And so we had to find some way to narrow that down. We narrowed the list down to 572. It was an initial cut by looking at, using three criteria. One was the article had to be available in full. It had to be in a peer-reviewed journal, and it had to be relevant to collective leadership in the public realm in some way. But we did exclude articles that were just sort of very narrowly focused on, for example, board staff relations or the structure of a leadership team. So then we looked at 572 abstracts and then identified 82 articles that really dealt with collective leadership in some way in the public realm. And these are in addition to the review articles that Barbara was mentioning. So, so here's some numbers here that 4 of them talked about plural or co-leaders in a government context. 25 of them focused on a focal leader or a leader role engaged in cross-boundary, multi-sector leadership. The largest fraction were focused on multiple leaders engaged in cross-boundary, multi-sector leadership. 6 of them put forward a kind of comprehensive leadership framework, and 4 paid strong attention to public value and public values. And I must say, I was really struck by how many, in contrast to this last finding, I was struck by how many titles in this conference have public values somewhere in the title. It was really quite a switch. Our observations: what are the most popular leadership theories in order in these articles? First is none, or very little. So leadership is kind of I don't know, just sort of a label that people use. They don't really actually draw on leadership theory very much directly. Second, distributed leadership, which was an approach developed primarily in the field of education. I think actually here in the UK originally. Integrative leadership, most of the articles there actually come out of a special issue of Leadership Quarterly that Barb and I co-edited. Political leadership is the fourth, but it's not a very well developed kind of approach to political leadership. Attention to diversity, typically none. There are aspects of diversity, though, that show up. One is looking at different countries or different areas of the world, particularly North America and Europe, but there is some attention to Asia and Africa. There are a variety of policy areas or contexts that people look at. And in terms of methodology, the predominant methodology is the single case study. There's some use of statistical methods, some use of participant observation, and some use of narrative analysis. So one way to summarize this is if there's no or little attention to leadership theory, there's no attention to diversity, you're relying on single case studies, there's going to be very slow progress for the field. So that's our summary of the last 10 years. And then that is not to say that there hasn't been lots of good work done. That's not what we're saying here. Just that there are some limitations to the approaches that have been predominant in the last 10 years.
And if you want to get a more nuanced look, we did supply the full table of our analysis of these 82 articles that made the final cut. So that's available. And it's hard to say, you know, out of all of that, what are all the key findings and contributions? The one thing that we pulled out to offer to you is this finding that unless the initiators of government reforms really allow for leaders at multiple levels in multiple kinds of organizations to adapt those reforms to local context and to the individuals and groups involved, they will not work very well. I mean, that in a way is a common sense finding, but it was pretty strong as we looked at all of these articles together. And then the second point was what was not there. Not very much attention to these competing models of leadership and insights about what contributes to the continued appeal of the command and control, heroic, individualistic model of leadership. There was one article that we talk about in the paper by McDermott and Lopez and Hatami that really explores the I would say biological and evolutionary reasons that we might, in particular circumstances and contexts, be drawn to one model of leadership versus another. So I would suggest looking at that article if you're kind of intrigued by that.
Actually, so just to repeat, the full version of our paper should be available on the conference website.
It's a draft paper.
But it's a draft, yeah, so it has not been accepted for publication. So the path forward, one thing that we would like to emphasize in this conference is clearly was reading our minds, we think that it's important for the work on leadership for addressing public purposes really should explicitly incorporate direct attention to public values and the creation of public value. That's important. We'd also like to see much more testing of a variety of the theories that have been developed, including distributed leadership theory in areas outside of education, integrative leadership theory, and so on.
And we'd also hope that scholars in public leadership would both consult the field of general leadership studies more fully. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of ferment now around collectivistic practice in leadership. So, there was a big issue of Leadership Quarterly, I think last year, on collective leadership. So, consulting that. You might spend some time with servant leadership, which seems to have some applicability in the public realm. Social identity theory, evolutionary leadership, I would say network-based leadership. So there's a lot going on in the general field of leadership studies right now that I would hope we as public leadership scholars would draw on a little more. We also urge everyone to roam a little more freely among the disciplines. Look at gender studies, for example, thinking about how to remedy some of this lack of attention to racial diversity, gender, class, national origins, etc., would be very helpful, we think. Critical theory, which you Europeans do a lot better job of than we do in the US. Critical theory could be extremely important, I think. History, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, moral psychology, aesthetics and design. I would, really encourage you to go and look at those other kind of unusual disciplines for us.
And lastly, we recommend expanding the methodological repertoire that people use. So case studies are useful, but comparative case studies are better. And longitudinal comparative case studies are better yet. Of course, it's difficult to do those things, which is one reason why there are not so many of them in the literature. But it's the comparison and contrast over time is really where a lot of gains are likely to be made in advancing leadership theory and practice, for that matter, as well. The use of mixed methods would be very helpful, because leadership's a complex phenomenon, and you can, using multiple methods is a helpful way of getting at it in a richer, deeper way. Much more attention to causal mechanisms would be very helpful, or causation generally. And we're not using causation in some kind of narrow positivistic sense, but just trying to understand what leads to what is really important. If you're interested in making the world a better place, you need to have some kind of theory about what will make the world a better place. You know, what causes what. So attending to causation, however you want to define it, is a really important thing to do. The world will ideally be made better by understanding causation in leadership more deeply than we do right now.